This is one of the strongest builds in Dragon Age the Veilguard from minute 1 until hour 70. This build is pretty close to the strongest build possible every step of the way. If you are looking for one of the easiest possible nightmare experiences, then this is the build for you. You've likely already seen this build as it is extremely popular and absurdly powerful. The amount of shields you'll be slinging will make Captain America look like an amateur. Now let's look at the early game. In character creation, the two best options will be Watch for the additional affliction damage, but even better would be Veil Ranger for the extra weak point damage. However, I would personally recommend Watch for the synergy with the thematic, and because alongside Grey Wardens, they have the best faction backstory. As always, Warrior's early game is insane. This build is no different as it utilizes the sword and shield alongside some pretty great passives to absolutely dominate the early portions of the game. The primary spells in the early game will be Titan Stomp, Driving Kick, and Deadly Ground. Titan Stomp is the best early warrior spell in the entire game. It gives you an area of effect CC that deals decent damage, applies Overwhelm, and most importantly, it does not cost you any rage, allowing you to save the rage for your other abilities. Driving Kick is a very solid ability for warriors early on as it allows you to cheese high health targets by simply just kicking them off the edge. Most of the time for this build, you'll want to use your rage on Bloody Advance, but there's plenty of scenarios in this game where punting your enemies off the edge and saving yourself a few minutes of fighting is the correct choice. This ability is incredibly fun and satisfying. Finally, Bloody Advance. This ability is a projectile of blades that applies Sundered, applies Bleeding, and causes enemies to explode if you hit them with a shield while they are still impaled, giving you even more AoE damage. For the early game important passives, we have Shield Volley, which is probably the most important warrior skill in the early game. By far, utilize this heavily to basically bounce your shield back and forth, killing ranged enemies with ease. You can bounce it 3 times and deal a ton of damage. Next up, we have Return to Sender. This basically allows you to return projectiles back to the enemy, meaning you can return pretty much everything except for red attacks back to the enemy at this point after you get this passive. Now after level 20 we enter the mid to late game and we will be acquiring the Reaper specialization and the Reaper ability. Bloody Advance will be the same ability in the late game. We are still slinging our shield around and this will make you deal more damage with it. So make sure to slap this on a high health target and all the enemies around it before tossing your shield around for just a little bit more damage. Reaper is just a pretty solid ability that applies Siphon, which is our really only form of lifesteal in the build. It also slowly deals necrotic damage to the enemies. Just use this ability when you need to get some life back. Deadly Ground really isn't the most insane spell in this build, but it does synergize with the fact that our abilities have cooldowns now because of one of the passives later on called Dazzle. This passive gives us Quickened if an area ability hits multiple targets. So basically Deadly Ground is pretty much just used as a vehicle to give us Quickened. The extra tick damage is just an added bonus. Spirit Storm is a super awesome ultimate. I'm not sure how great it is, but it is pretty decent oh crap button for if you ever get in trouble, as it applies Siphon to enemies, which will get us some life back. It's also just a super fun ability to use. For late game important passives, there really is only one really important one that you need to know for this Reaper build, and that is Perfect Throw. Make sure you are releasing your shield toss as soon as the charge level increases to get more bounces and more damage. This is a very important skill to know and to understand. For the Reaper's equipment, for weapons we're going to be using the Dark Shard. The Dark Shard is pretty much only here because of the 15% necrotic damage boost, and overall just giving us more necrotic damage. This build is entirely necrotic damage based, so 15% more necrotic damage is pretty nice. For our shield, we're going to be running the Skirmisher's Round. This gives us 15% range attack damage, 15% weak point damage, and an extra damage on shield toss bounce, which is very nice. This entire build is built around tossing your shield. One of the other shields that I did consider was the Necropolis Defender, as it gives you more necrotic damage, one more shield toss bounce, and when you charge it to maximum, it applies necrosis to the first target hit You can also definitely run that as well if you want. I just feel like this one's generally better. But this one's probably better if, say, you're versus Antom, who are very weak to necrotic damage. For our axe, we're running the Fade Touched War Axe, pretty much just because it gives us some extra little damage. There's really not any great axes to run with this build, unfortunately. You probably could run the Etched Raider's axe, I guess, for the extra charge attack damage. There really isn't anything very good, or if you want more defense, you can run the Vigilant Great Hammer. I personally run the Fade Touched War Axe. It gives just decent damage. Next up, we have the Field Commander's Helm. This is probably one of the top 5 most broken pieces of equipment in the entire game. I haven't utilized it on any of my other warrior builds. You could easily slap this on my champion build and go completely ham with it. This basically makes it so you deal a ton of damage. This in combination with the Vivify rune means you can cast 6 spells pretty much instantaneously, and your damage, the big passive is that your damage is increased by 1% for every 2 rage. This build has about 350 rage, I believe, so you're basically getting an extra 175% damage boost by having this helmet on, which is completely absurd. For our armor piece, we are running the Jumper's Deft Leathers. These are the best armor piece in the game if you're running a ranged build. You get more ranged attack damage, more charged shield toss damage. You gain 100 defense while charging your shield. This is actually really nice. I've taken a lot of shots while charging my shield, and the damage you take is significantly less because of this armor. For our belt, we are running the Twin Buckle Binding. This is my favorite belt generally in the entire game. It gives 10% more ability damage and heals you for 100 upon using any ability while quickened. Now I do use quickened in this build quite often, so it is pretty nice for healing in that sense. Which brings us to our amulet, the Hala's Grace, entirely built around quickened. Because our helmet makes it so all of our abilities are on 60-second cooldowns, quickened is super good in this build to allow us to spam our abilities more often. Quickened basically lowers the cooldown probably in half, I would say, as long as you have it up. So having Quickened is fantastic for this build. Next up we have our rings. First up is the Graven Opal. The Graven Opal gives us more ranged attack damage, more weak point damage, and that's pretty much it. That's pretty much all we want, more ranged attack damage. This build is entirely based around whipping your shield at the enemy and smoking them as hard as you can. Lastly, we have the Precious Decay. This entire build is necrotic damage based, so more necrotic damage does not hurt. For our runes, as mentioned before, I am using Vivify. This is the best rune in the entire game, I'm pretty sure, but especially so when in combination with the Field Commander's Helm. The Field Commander's Helm allows us to use our 3 abilities right away, then cast Vivify, and then boom, we have 3 more abilities that are souped up with a ton of extra damage from the Field Commander's Helm. For our other 2 runes, I am running Toss, which gives us an additional bounce on our shield toss, which is very nice. And lastly, Scourge, which just gives us 10% more necrotic damage. For our companions, hands down, the 2 best companions you can run for this build are Emmerich and Lucanus. Both are heavily necrotic based and help us do a lot more necrotic based damage, and that's pretty much all it comes down to. You also fulfill the roles of rogue, mage, and warrior very well with them. Emmerich has attack my target applying vulnerability, as does Lucanus with the Butcher's Screw. Emmerich also applies vulnerability anytime he applies weakened with this ring. These are the skills I like to use for him. The Belt Holes is especially nice because Quietus reduces the target's resistance to necrotic damage by 25%, allowing you to hit those necrotic shots even harder. And then I always run the auto ability that every companion has, which he has Unfinished Business. This applies Weaken, which as we know, makes them more invulnerable, and then Final Rites just to detonate sundered attacks. For Lucanus, as mentioned before, he also applies vulnerability to necrotic damage. You probably don't really need to double up on it, but I do because why not? My favorite ability that he has is Adrenaline Rush. It is the ability that he casts on his own every 60 seconds. It grants us enhanced damage, which also gives us precision after this upgrade. I also like to run Eviscerate on him, which permanently reduces enemy necrotic resistance and just deals very nice damage. And lastly, Debilitate to apply Sunder to enemies. For playstyle, the goal will pretty much be to kill as much things as possible with your shield as fast as possible. I usually start the fights off with a charged shield attack, dump all of my abilities, then cast Vivify. Then dump all of my abilities again while slowly slinging around shields. After you've tossed your shield a couple times and dumped all your abilities, then just clean up whatever enemies are remaining with even more shields and light attacks. As a reminder, there is a link in the description to a full level by level guide. Let me know what you think about the build in the comments down below, and please click the like button if this video was helpful. Thank you all very much for watching, and I will see you all next time.